The night Daniel Carter walked up that gravel driveway, he had already decided it would be his last night. Not in the dramatic way people sometimes mean when they say such things, simply in the way a man decides when he has counted everything he has left and found the number too small to matter. $47, wet boots, a dead phone, a jacket that had stopped keeping the rain out somewhere around mile 15 of a Montana highway that did not care whether he lived or disappeared into its darkness. He was 32 years old, and he had become the man he once swore on his mother's grave he would never become. And the worst part, the part that sat heaviest in his chest as he walked through the storm, was not the hunger or the cold or even the humiliation. It was the silence, the complete, unbroken silence of a life that had contracted so far inward that there was no one left to call, no one who would pick up, no one who would notice if the rain took him tonight and kept him. He stopped walking because his legs stopped first. He stood in the middle of that dark Montana road and he tilted his face up into the rain and he let it fall on him, and he thought, with a kind of exhausted clarity that only comes at the very bottom of things, "This is it. This is what I have made of myself." And then he saw it. Through the dark, through the curtain of rain bending sideways in the wind, a single light, warm and yellow and burning at the end of a long gravel driveway, as if it had been left on specifically for him, as if someone, somewhere, had known he was coming and had wanted him to find his way. Daniel stood very still and stared at that light for a long time. An old white farmhouse sat behind it. 2 stories, a wide porch, smoke rising from a stone chimney in slow gray ribbons that the wind kept tearing apart. The windows glowed amber from within. It looked like something a person dreams about when they have been without warmth for too long. He hated what he was about to do. His father's voice rose immediately, automatic and contemptuous. A real man handles his own problems. He had heard those words his entire childhood, spoken with the certainty of a man who used them to justify never asking for help and never offering it. His father had died at 61, alone in a trailer outside of Akron with a bottle on the nightstand and no one to call the ambulance. Daniel had promised himself he would be different, and yet here he was, walking up a stranger's driveway in the rain. He stood on the porch for a long moment before he knocked, long enough to rehearse, long enough to almost turn back. Then he raised his fist and knocked, and the sound was small and uncertain against the size of the storm. Nothing. He knocked again. A full minute passed. Then the door opened and a woman stood in the frame holding a lantern, its flame throwing warm, unsteady light across her face, and Daniel felt something shift instantly in his chest. She was in her late 70s, silver hair, small hands, a face that had been through enough that it no longer needed to perform anything. Not alarm, not suspicion, not false warmth. She simply looked at him, carefully, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "My truck broke down about 20 miles back. I'm not asking for money. I was just wondering if maybe I could sleep in your barn tonight, just until the rain passes." The woman studied him in the lantern light. The silence stretched. Then she asked, quietly and without any ceremony at all, "When's the last time you ate?" Daniel looked away. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Something in her voice, not sharp, nothing like sharp, but certain in the way that very few voices ever are, caught him completely without defense. He had no prepared answer for that tone. He had no wall built against that particular quality of concern. "Yesterday morning," he said. She opened the door wider. "Come inside." "Ma'am, I really can't." "Young man." Her voice did not rise. It simply settled, like a hand placed gently but firmly on a shoulder. Nobody knocks on a stranger's door in a storm unless life has already done the humbling. Now come inside before you catch your death. Daniel Carter stepped across the threshold of Eleanor Marsh's home, and nothing in either of their lives would ever be entirely the same again. The house smelled like chicken soup. It hit him before he had taken 3 steps, that deep, warm, specific smell that belongs not just to food, but to a particular kind of safety, the kind that only exists in certain kitchens on certain evenings in a childhood you can never fully return to. Daniel stopped walking. His throat tightened so suddenly and so completely that for one terrible moment, he wasn't 32 and homeless in Montana. He was 9 years old and standing in his mother's kitchen in Columbus, watching her move around the stove with a dish towel over her shoulder. And the world was still small enough to feel entirely safe. His mother, Margaret Carter, had died of cancer 8 years ago. He had held her hand at the end, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light. And she had looked at him with eyes that were already going somewhere he could not follow. And she had said, "You are going to be all right, Daniel. You just have to let people in." He had nodded and told her he would. And then he had spent 8 years proving himself wrong. Eleanor set a bowl of soup on the kitchen table without fanfare, without expectation, without any of the performance that charity sometimes carries. Beside it, she placed a thick slice of bread, still warm from the oven. She sat across from him with her tea and looked not at his face, but at her own hands, giving him the privacy of an unwatched moment. Daniel stared at the bowl. He had intended to keep his composure, to eat efficiently and say thank you, and get through it cleanly. But his eyes filled without any warning at all, and he turned away hard, jaw clenched, furious at himself. Eleanor did not draw attention to it. She simply said, without looking up, the words he had not heard spoken to him since his mother was alive. "Eat while it's hot." He ate, and somewhere between the first spoonful and the last piece of bread, something in Daniel that had been locked for 8 years began, almost imperceptibly, to open. He meant to leave the next morning. He genuinely meant it. But Eleanor mentioned over breakfast, without asking anything, that the fence along the east pasture had been broken since April, and the man who usually fixed things had moved to Billings. Daniel finished his coffee. Then he walked the fence line. He came back 2 hours later with mud to his knees and the fence repaired, and Eleanor looked at him from the porch with the particular expression of a woman who has long since learned the difference between a man who is passing through and the man who is looking for a reason to stay. She said nothing. He stayed another day, then another. A week became 2. He patched the barn roof, he rebuilt the gate, he cleared the storage shed that had not been properly opened in 3 years. Small jobs, honest jobs, the kind that gave shape to empty hours and asked nothing of a man except that he show up and do the work. And in doing them, Daniel found something he had not felt in a very long time. The quiet, specific satisfaction of being useful, of mattering in the small daily ways that, added together, make up most of what a life actually is. One afternoon, he was clearing the far corner of the barn when he found the photograph. It was tucked inside an old wooden crate, wrapped in a square of flannel cloth as carefully as something precious. A young man in a United States Army dress uniform, 22, maybe 23 years old, square jaw, dark eyes that carried light in them. Smiling with the full brightness of someone who does not yet know what the world costs. And beside him, Eleanor, younger, dark-haired, her face unlined, looking at the soldier, not at the camera, her expression carrying everything a mother's face carries when she is looking at a child she loves more than she has words for, and knows, in some place beneath conscious thought, that love alone is not enough to keep him safe. Daniel carried the photograph to the barn doorway where Eleanor stood in the afternoon light. "Your son?" Her hands received it the way hands receive something they have held 10,000 times. "Matthew." She said the name quietly, carefully, the way people say the names of the dead when the dead have not gone far enough to stop being present. "He was Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." She paused. "He didn't come home from the second one." Daniel was quiet. "I'm sorry." People say that. Her voice was not bitter, just worn smooth by years of receiving those words. "Because it's true." "Yes," she said, "but what they mean is they're sorry he died. That's one thing." She looked at the photograph. "What I carry is different. I'm sorry he never got to grow old, never got to sit on this porch in October and feel that particular tiredness that comes from a life well spent. Never got to argue with his own kids about something foolish, never got to become whatever he was going to become." Her thumb moved across the image of his face. Her voice did not break. It simply became very quiet, the way a flame shrinks in a draft without going out. "He would have been something, Daniel. He really would have been something." Daniel sat down on a hay bale beside her. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better and more honestly. He simply stayed. And Eleanor, who had spent 14 years being told by well-meaning people that time heals and heaven is real and Matthew is in a better place, found that what she had needed all along was not reassurance. It was simply this: another person willing to sit inside the weight of it without trying to lift it away. They sat together until the light went gold, and then amber, and then the long, slow blue of a Montana evening settled over the valley, and neither of them had any interest in being anywhere else. Summer came in hot that year. The work expanded. The vegetable garden Eleanor had let go to weeds came back in long green rows under Daniel's hands over 3 weekends in June. A neighbor stopped one afternoon, watched him work, and stayed for an hour just talking. Then another neighbor came. Then a family from the next property over brought a pie and ended up staying for dinner. The farmhouse, which had been very quiet for a very long time, began to fill up in the small daily ways that houses fill when someone who knows how to be present takes up residence in them. One evening in late July, Daniel was standing at the far end of the barn, staring at a workbench he had been circling for weeks without quite allowing himself to approach. It was long and solid, built from thick oak, its surface scarred with decades of work. Above it, tools hung on pegboards in careful order: hand planes, chisels, draw knives, marking gauges, every one of them covered in a thin layer of dust but hung with the precision of a man who respected his work enough to put it away properly. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "You've been looking at that bench every day for a month," she said. Daniel didn't turn around. "It's a good bench. Harold built it himself 40 years ago." A silence settled. "Harold was your husband." 31 years. She came to stand beside Daniel, looking at the tools. He built furniture his whole life. Chairs, tables, cabinets, cradles. People came from 3 counties over. He used to say, she paused and smiled with the particular softness of someone quoting a voice they still hear clearly. He used to say that good hands are God's way of asking a question, and idle hands are a man's way of refusing to answer. Daniel looked at his own hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent years doing work that meant nothing. Warehouse work, delivery work, whatever kept the rent paid until the rent stopped getting paid. But they were also the hands of a man who had once spent 2 years in a Columbus woodshop learning to feel the grain of wood the way a reader feels the meaning beneath the words, intuitively, physically, with something deeper than the eyes. "I used to build furniture," he said. He had not said this out loud to anyone in years. "I was good at it. I had plans once, my own shop, my own name above a door." Eleanor waited. What happened to those plans? He almost said life. He stopped himself. "I got knocked down enough times that I decided it was safer to stop trying to stand up." Eleanor turned to face him directly. "Pain has a way of making itself sound like wisdom," she said. "It tells you that you've learned something important when really it's only taught you to be afraid." She crossed the barn to Harold's old workbench and opened the bottom drawer. She took out a key, iron, old, lightly rusted, and held it out to him. "Harold's workshop is behind the barn," she said. "I locked it the week after the funeral, and I haven't opened it since. 6 years. Daniel looked at the key in her outstretched hand. "Eleanor, I can't." "You can," she said. "Simple. Certain. Harold had no sons. Matthew had no sons, and I am an old woman with a locked workshop full of good tools and nobody left to use them." Her eyes met his steadily. "I am not giving you charity, Daniel. I am asking you to answer the question." He took the key, and when his fingers closed around it, he felt, in a way he could not have explained to anyone, that he was holding something much larger than iron. He was holding permission, the rarest and most necessary thing one human being can offer another. Not money, not sympathy. Permission. You are still worth believing in. Go prove it. The workshop door opened on 6 years of beautiful silence. The smell came first, sawdust and linseed oil and the particular dry sweetness of seasoned wood. And it was so specific and so exactly the smell of everything Daniel had walked away from that he had to stand in the doorway for a full minute before he could make his feet move. The tools were extraordinary. Organized, cared for, a lifetime of accumulated craft hung on those walls and stacked on those shelves, and Daniel moved through the space the way a man moves through a place he has been before in dreams. He started small. A replacement board for Eleanor's porch step, a new frame for the barn door, a small oak cabinet for the hallway that he finished on a Thursday evening and carried inside and set against the wall, and Eleanor stood looking at it for a long moment and then looked at him and said nothing, but her eyes said everything that needed saying. Word traveled. In small Montana towns, word always travels. Quietly and faster than anyone plans. A neighbor asked if he might build a blanket chest. He built it. Another neighbor wanted a kitchen table. Oak, 6 chairs, the kind that seats a family for 30 years of dinners. He built that too. By the 3rd month, there was a waiting list. By the 5th month, Eleanor's driveway on weekend afternoons looked entirely different from anything it had ever looked like before. Trucks and cars parked along the gravel and out onto the road. Men who worked with their hands standing in the workshop doorway watching Daniel work, watching him move through the space with the confidence of a man who has found the thing he was made to do and is doing it without apology. Women who had driven 40 miles asking about custom cabinets, about cradles for new grandchildren, about dining tables that would outlast everyone sitting around them. And in the evenings, the neighbors would sometimes stay. And Eleanor would make coffee, and the porch would fill up with conversation the way it had not in years. And the farmhouse that had been so quiet for so long became gradually and genuinely the kind of place people were glad to come to. On a Saturday morning in early October, 11 months after Daniel had first walked up that gravel driveway in the rain, the entire town of Mill Haven, Montana, gathered at Eleanor Marsh's farm. Not because anyone organized it, not because of a flyer or a phone call or a formal invitation, but because word had spread the way word spreads in small towns when something true is happening, person to person, over fences and across diner tables, in the particular way that news travels when it is not news but story. Daniel had built something. The sign went up that morning, carved from a single plank of Harold's aged walnut, routed by hand, stained dark and hung above the workshop door with 2 iron brackets Daniel had forged himself in the weeks prior. Carter and Sons Custom Woodworks. Eleanor stood on the porch with her coffee and read it. She was quiet for a long time. Harold's name, she said finally, her voice very soft. It was always Harold's place, Daniel said. He was standing beside her looking at the sign. Always will be. Eleanor looked at him then, and she did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say, but her eyes were full in the way that eyes go full when a person has been handed something they had stopped expecting the world to give them. The neighbors who had come that morning stood in the yard looking at the sign, and at the workshop, and at Daniel, and at Eleanor, and more than a few of them were quietly wiping their eyes because they understood, the way people who have lived long enough always understand, exactly what they were seeing. They were seeing a woman who had lost a husband and a son give everything she had left to a stranger who arrived with nothing. And they were seeing that stranger become, in the space of 11 months, someone who gave it all back, not in kind, but in full, with interest, in the particular currency of loyalty and purpose and daily love that does not announce itself, but simply shows up every morning without fail. That evening, after the neighbors had gone and the workshop was locked, and the valley had gone amber and then dark, Daniel came up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside Eleanor the way he always did now in the last hour before dinner. The porch light was on, that same warm yellow light that had guided him up this driveway on the worst night of his life. He looked at it for a moment. Eleanor followed his gaze. "You know," she said softly, "you never did sleep in the barn." Daniel laughed. It was the laugh of a man who was genuinely happy, easy and full and carrying no weight at all. "No, ma'am." His voice went quiet. Instead, you gave me a home." Eleanor reached over and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were small and cool and completely steady. Below them, the valley lay dark and still. The workshop light burned warm in the dusk, and Daniel Carter, who had walked up this driveway 11 months ago with nothing but wet boots and a heart that had nearly stopped believing in anything, sat beside the woman who had opened her door and felt, all the way down to the deepest and truest part of himself, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Because that is what one act of grace does. It does not merely solve the crisis in front of it. It reaches into the future of a person and rearranges it. It tells them in the most convincing language available, the language of soup and bread and a rusted key and a porch light left burning, that they are still worth something, that the world still has room for them, that the story is not over. Eleanor Marsh had not done anything extraordinary. She had opened a door, she had made a meal, she had handed over a key, she had sat in a barn, and let grief be grief without trying to fix it. She had pointed at a man's chest and told him that pain was not wisdom. And in doing those small, quiet, ordinary things, she had saved a life. Not from a river, not from a fire, from the slowest and most dangerous thing a life can drown in, from the belief that it is not worth saving. If this story reached something inside of you, if it reminded you that one open door, one warm meal, one simple act of belief in another person can change the entire direction of a life, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories, where every week we bring you the stories of quiet heroes and ordinary people who changed the world simply by choosing to be kind. Hit the bell notification so you never miss a single story. Because somewhere tonight, there is a person walking through a storm looking for a light, and you might be the one who left it on. This story holds genuine educational and human value across multiple dimensions. It brings honest attention to the reality of sudden homelessness and economic collapse, reminding viewers that hardship does not arrive only for the reckless or the undeserving, but can reach any person at any point in a life through the accumulation of loss and circumstance. It honors the grief of a Gold Star mother with dignity and depth, presenting the particular anguish of a parent who outlives a child lost to military service, an experience shared by thousands of American families who rarely see their pain reflected with this kind of care. It demonstrates the restoration of identity and purpose through meaningful work, showing that vocational reconnection is not a luxury, but a genuine form of healing for people who have lost their sense of place in the world. It models a form of community that is built not through institutions or programs, but through individual human attention, the choice made one person at a time to see another person fully and respond to what they see with something more than sympathy. And at its deepest level, it is a meditation on the difference between charity and belief, between giving a person something and trusting that a person has something left worth giving. These are lessons that belong to every generation and every background, which is why stories like this one find their way into the hearts of the people who need them most and stay there.